Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 57th episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled A Reflection on Death. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non denominational Bible based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. And so the teaching agenda today, first we're going to discuss the disclaimer. Then we're going to talk about the definition of death. Then we're going to talk about the inspiration for the teaching, as well as ancient perspectives on death and burial across cultures and times. Then we're going to look at perspectives on death from major world religions and modern belief systems, like secular humanism, and then also the uniqueness of Christianity in its view of death. And so, first, a disclaimer, as always, too. This teaching is somewhat critical of other major world religions, but it's not intended to be offensive. It's just highlighting the positives and negatives of what they say about death. So if you belong to one of those religions or you identify with one of those religions, it's not meant to be offensive. Just know that beforehand. But getting to the definition of death, because there's actually not an agreement, believe it or not, on what death is. But the definition of death is the total cessation of life processes that eventually occurs in all living organisms, except maybe one, Jesus. But its precise definition remains controversial, differing according to culture and legal systems. And I remember when I was in nursing school, actually, that was a conversation that was brought up. Was there's not sort of a universal definition of what death is or what it means. But I wanted to talk about what inspired this talk in the first place. And it was my friend, my good pal Jared. He was actually my best man at my wedding. I was talking to his wife Laura at one of their kids' birthday parties, and one of the things that inspired me to make this teaching was she was talking about their dogs, Coda and Tally, and they were talking about how she was talking about how they're getting older and like Coda's losing her hearing and Tally's blind in one eye, and she was talking about how they're getting closer to death and how sad it was. But I didn't know her to be religious in any way, and I don't believe she is in any way. She's more like secular humanist, more like, and I'll talk about what that means exactly. But she's mostly just sort of like non-religious. But she identified death as being bad, and I thought that was a really interesting take because there's not really a lot in secular culture that teaches that death is a bad thing, and so I wanted to talk about that and explore that and unpack that a little bit about what she meant. But first, we have to talk about just because religions across the world have identified the problem of death and what to do about it. And I wanted to explore that a little bit too, like death and burial in the ancient world. And so, with the introduction, death is the final rite of passage experienced by all, and it has been held in awe and fear since humans first became conscious of their mortality in Paleolithic times. Death came to be regarded as a major rite of passage that many religious systems addressed in great depth. Mortality, death, and the unknown were ritualized out of a mixture of affection for the deceased, awe of death's mysteries, and the obligation to prepare for an afterlife. It is likely that death and the afterlife generated a fear that haunted people more than any other experience or reality. And so everything possible was done to prepare the departed for the unknown world they would enter. A change in status from life to death could not be taken lightly. Fear and awe concerning death were present since prehistoric times, as was a belief that the deceased were a source of blessings and beneficence, especially if the rite of passage was properly ritualized. So as you can see, there was a lot of ritual involved with a lot of ancient cultures. Such sentiments evolved into a cult of the dead in many early societies, and many prehistoric people developed some form of religion and perhaps a belief in some type of afterlife. And that's what I thought was interesting too, is like exploring and having a reflection upon death is how every major world religion tries to make sense of it, and it's something that is part of the universal human experience is the fear of death. But various primitive societies throughout sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Oceania, and Latin America are mirrors of Stone Age views concerning the soul, the hereafter, and corpse disposal. Death, if not caused by violence, is generally ascribed to actions of supernatural spirits or to witchcraft. And so that's what a lot of ancient religions thought of, is that Death was caused by supernatural spirits or witchcraft. In the Call to the Dead, attitudes toward the deceased and their afterlife generally revolved around fear of the power of the spirit and diligence in performance of death rituals. Full burial ensured proper dispatch to the next life. Partial performance resulted in the dead becoming unsanctified ghosts that haunted the living in an attempt to get grievances rectified. And so that's something that ancient cultures were very much um, very meticulous about, was burying the body properly, because then they felt like if not, that person's spirit would come after you. That was something that was sort of a theme in ancient religions. Hence, the dead were treated in different ways, not only for reasons of status, but also as a sanction on those who remained behind. And so the people that were burying them were worried about how death would come for them, or how their death would affect them. Because the spirit of a dead person was often viewed as a dangerous source of harm, sickness, and death, the corpse had to be removed as soon as possible to minimize catching death. This fear explains in part why bodies were buried in various ways, burned or removed from sight in some manner. And there actually might be some. It makes sense why they did that too, because especially if someone had like an infection or something like that, or if someone had something that could spread to a person nearby, it makes sense that they would try to remove it as soon as possible so that they wouldn't catch that the cause of death. And so it kind of made sense from a scientific perspective as well, even though they probably didn't realize that. Um, the need to control the spirit influenced what people did with the dead. Inhumation, which means burial, I found out. Cremation, exposure, and abandonment of the corpse have their origins in beliefs about death, the power of the spirit in the afterlife. And so, inhumation, burial was the most prevalent practice among ancient peoples and appears to have been an earlier practice than cremation. And so, burial was it's still probably the most common form, and it's probably the earliest one as well. Um, but it was burial of the dead was first associated with Paleolithic people some 25,000 years ago. And this is very much from an evolutionary perspective, by the way. This isn't from like a Christian perspective that this article is written. Um, but burial represents one of humankind's earliest cultural achievements. Homo sapiens, who seems to have shared most of the physical, psychological characteristics of modern humans, deliberately buried their dead, covered the body with red ochre to give it a blood red color of renewed vitality, and provided food, flowers, and useful paraphernalia near the body, all of which suggests a human concern for the welfare of the deceased and perhaps a belief in some sort of survival after death. And so, as you can see, this was a concern even from ancient times. From a secular perspective, over 25,000 years ago, there were people leaving food, flowers, and other things near the body. And so it was sort of out of a concern. And that's still things that we do today. In various regions of southern Europe, the Middle East, and Central and South Asia, Neanderthal caves reveal ample evidence of respect for the dead. The same inhumation or burial practice was followed among Cro Magnon people some 10,000 years ago, with bodies interred in a flexed position, covered with animal shoulder blades, and smeared with red ochre amidst shells, bone necklaces, tools, and other items. And so, as you can see, even 10,000 years ago, there was Cro Magnon people that had they buried their loved ones with shells, necklaces, tools, and other items. And so, there's evidence that cremation, um, or there's evidence that people were doing the same things we were doing back then. But there's also evidence that cremation or cannibalism may have occurred because only skulls were found in some grottos, and a grotto is basically a cave. But this may suggest a type of ancestor worship with a possible belief the spirit rested in the head and the consumption of the brain absorbed the soul essence. And so cannibalism, which was more widely practiced than previously believed, has persisted from prehistoric times down into the 21st century. And that's something that has a huge stigma, but it's not something that's sort of unknown to ancient cultures and also still exists even today. We think of like Hannibal Lecter, of course, and fictional characters like that. But various reasons underlie the custom of anthropophagy, which is the consumption of men, or cannibalism, which such as hunger, acquisition of a victim's strength or soul, magic, revenge, religious sacrifice, or honor of the dead. And the custom has survived in various degrees among certain Australian Aborigines, sub-Saharan African primitives, societies of Oceania, and New Guinea. And I remember actually being in school, and we talked about that in New Guinea, actually, is that still persists today because it's sort of a custom where they eat their dead. But then that's a big risk today because of prions, which are proteinaceous infectious organisms. And those are the cause of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, which is also known as mad cow disease in cows. And so humans can ingest that if they eat a brain that's been infected with that. And so that's something that's a concern among New Guinea um, residents. But grotto or cave burial progressed and took a huge step forward among the ancient Egyptians, whose elaborate tombs and mummification techniques were developed in preparation for an afterlife. And everybody all knows too that the Egyptians were notorious for mummification. They would turn them into mummies. And mummification is associated with the cult of the dead and ancestor worship, and was designed to preserve the body as a permanent residence for the soul. The corpse was provided with numerous items he or she loved in life and could enjoy again in the land of the dead. The pyramids were erected for the pharaohs and mastabas for servants and royal aides near the ruler's tomb. They were elaborately decorated inside with murals of daily Egyptian life and filled with treasures. The pyramid represented a staircase to heaven for the mummified body of the ruler, who was believed to become one with Osiris, the god of death. And Osiris, I think, was the one with the bird head. Because the ancient Egyptians believed that the soul needed a lasting body in which to dwell, rules and rituals of mummification were observed meticulously so that the soul would proceed properly to the underworld. And so, as we know, the Egyptians had this big, association with the afterlife, that they were very meticulous about the body and the burial rites. And there's a lot of mummified corpses still left over today that are in museums as well as still in Egypt. And it was actually interesting too. I read about what exactly is mummification, because everybody knows like what a mummy is. You basically put the gauze over them and things like that. But I didn't realize too that mummification is basically drying out the body. And so it's basically an attempt to dry out the body before it can rot. And so rotting happens because of bacteria and water, bacteria eating the corpse basically. But if you dry out the corpse, it doesn't allow bacteria to flourish, and so then the corpse cannot rot. And so that's basically what mummification is it's drying out the corpse to the point where it can't rot. It's basically turning a human's body into leather. And that's basically what leather is like tanning is essentially just drying out the material so much that it can't rot. And it's the same thing we do to trees, anything living, that we make it so dry that it can't possibly be destroyed by bacteria. And that's really what mummification is. Such elaborate burial practices were also followed in the Middle East around 3000 BC. And before I jump to that too, I wanted to say I'm always fascinated by Egyptian culture too, because of their elaborate rituals of death, because it reminds me of those movies, The Mummy and The Mummy Returns. So I always thought that those were really good. And I'm not sure how accurate they are, but they have a pretty interesting view of like Egyptian death and things like that. It has a sort of a slice of culture in those movies. But again, the corpse was buried with personal property, soldiers, courtiers, and servants, all to serve their master in the afterlife. And then in Europe, around 3500 to 1500 BC, hunter-gathering cultures along the Atlantic seaboard built massive megalithic tombs of standing rocks. And around 500 BC, various cultures accepted inhumation as a custom, meaning burial. The Etruscans of Italy, the Druids of the British Isle, and the Huns, which were about 300 AD. In Bronze Age Scandinavia, around 500 BC, huge boulders were set around a grave in the outline of a ship to carry the soul to Valhalla, the palace of the god Odin. And so that was very common too amongst the Vikings. There's a show called Vikings actually that captures a lot of that, like the rituals that they used for burial, like they would light a boat on fire and then cast your body out to sea. That was very common burial ritual. And then also a sort of a forgotten place in Mesoamerica between 2000 BC and 700 AD, Olmec and Maya civilizations flourished in Mexico and Central America. The Olmecs buried their distinguished dead in tombs. This practice was followed by the Maya, a civilization preoccupied with death, the fate of the soul, reincarnation, an elaborate concept of hells, paradises, and mythical lands. So they also had a very elaborate sense of the afterlife. The good were rewarded with one of three paradises, and the evil were condemned to an inferno at the center of the earth. And so they very much had sort of a concept the same way that the Greeks did, where if you were good, you would go to heaven or up on Mount Olympus essentially, and if you were bad, you would be cast down into Hades. And so the Mayans also had sort of that understanding. The reincarnation was also part of Mayan theology. Cave burial was an archaic and widely distributed mode of burial still practiced in the Moluccas, the Philippines, Australia, Melanesia, Polynesia, Madagascar, and throughout Africa, where bodies or desiccated bones are placed in cliffs of rock. And so that's another sort of cave burial or grotto. Such burial chambers became forerunners of grandiose sepulchres, characteristic of ancient cultures. And a sepulcher is basically like a really elaborate um, tomb. Like it's kind of like where Jesus's body was. They actually have an area. Um, it's called the Holy Sepulcher. It's over in Israel. You can actually go visit it. Now, there's a lot of debate about whether that was actually Jesus's tomb, but regardless, among the Hebrews and Christians of the Middle East, the mortal body was sacred and was interred with love, dignity, and care. And so this is sort of getting more modern with the Hebrew and Christian understanding. Some Hebrews, such as the Sadducees, denied any conscious existence after death or bodily resurrection. And then the Pharisees, however, believed in bodily resurrection on earth. And I thought that was really interesting, actually, too, because they're both mentioned in the Bible, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Those were sort of the two ruling classes of different sects of Judaism at the time of Jesus. And it's interesting because the Sadducees, and I looked this up actually to verify just to make sure, but the Sadducees actually did not believe in any kind of heaven, and they did not believe in the bodily resurrection. And I wanted to explore that actually too, because I wonder how they dealt with the passages like, even though they didn't have the New Testament or regard the New Testament as canon, they still had the book of Daniel, and the book of Daniel talked about resurrection and judgment day and things like that. So I wonder how they reconciled that, or maybe they didn't consider Daniel to be authoritative or canon. But the Pharisees, they believed in bodily resurrection, um, which is pretty orthodox. And then cremation, as an alternate method of body disposal, was practiced by only a few cultures. Among them were Australian, Tasmanian, Siberian, Melanesian, and African groups. Um, and there is some evidence that it may have been used by Paleolithic people because traces of burning were found on some skeletal bones. And so it's possible that it was sort of an ancient practice, but they probably didn't have the mechanisms to create heat that high to burn the body efficiently. And also, it probably smelled really bad too. So that's another reason why they probably didn't do that. But during the Bronze and Iron Ages in Europe, around 6000 BC, agricultural communities practiced both cremation and inhumation. Germanic tribes and the Etruscans, circa 800 to 600 BC, consistently cremated the dead and buried the ashes in urns or ossuaries, either secured with a cap or buried under small mounds. The Greco-Romans likewise practiced cremation and inhumation. Although relatively common among European societies, cremation was not the custom in the Middle East. And so, even though it was relatively common among European societies, the Middle East, it was not a custom in the Middle East. That was virtually unknown. But crematory practice was and still is the custom par excellence of Vedic and Brahmanical in Brahmanical India. And so in India, it's very common practice to cremate the body. Still is and always was. In earliest India, horses were also sacrificed to carry the souls into the afterlife, which is unfortunate to hear for the horses. But only a few cultures of the ancient world practiced exposure of a corpse to decay or consumption by animals. So that was actually something that was known too, is they would just leave the body, somewhere in nature, and then the body would either rot or animals would get to it. But in early Egypt, disposal in desert regions was practiced but quickly replaced by embalming. Scythians in Central Asia suspended bodies in trees for the birds to consume, and the bones were collected and buried. I thought that was kind of interesting. They fed the birds with the body. Because the body was considered an empty shell whose spirit would be reborn in a new life no matter what happened to the body, Tibetans abandoned corpses to the vultures. And so they really placed no value on the body in Tibet. And so then they would just throw the body to the vultures. It didn't really matter. However, it was the Farsis of ancient Persia who ritualized exposure of bodies. And Farsis, actually, that was the ethnicity of Freddie Mercury, if I recall. The singer from Queen, he was Farsi. But they hail from ancient Persia. But bodies of the deceased were washed, clearly arrayed, and then removed to decay and be consumed by birds of prey. Suspension from tree branches, placement on scaffolds or summits of cliffs, placement on beds of vegetation and forest, abandonment to the elements, preying dogs and wild beasts, or immersion in the sea were various methods practiced by coastal societies of Australia, Andaman Islands, Irian Jaya, Ceylon, Siberia, Oceania, and Africa from the earliest times. And so that sort of exposure to the elements and to the animals was also a practice that was done by ancient cultures. And that was from Britannica. It was published in 2022 by George J. Hoynacke. And then going to the second part here, too, there's a source on that. But I wanted to look at death from the perspective of other major world religions and belief systems that are more modern. That was sort of an ancient perspective on death, but the perspective on death for major world religions, I wanted to really see what the six major religions had to say about death right now, and the six major world religions being Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Those are sort of the six religions, and then all of them have a basis like obviously Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all are Abrahamic religions, whereas Jainism, Buddhism, and Hinduism are all Dharmic religions, and so they all sort of hail from the same place, just like Abrahamic religions have a common thread to them. But I wanted to see what they had to say about death, and like Hinduism, very complicated, but Hindus believe in a cycle of death and rebirth called samsara. One is reborn or reincarnated, which is known as punarjanma, and to experience life again with the soul or atman, being transmigrated into a new physical body, whether human or animal. In the Hindu scripture Bhagavad Gita, Krishna explains this to Arjuna, saying that as a person sheds worn out garments and wears new ones, likewise at the time of death, the soul casts off its worn out body and enters a new one. And so that's very, very much something that Hinduism is a central tenet, is reincarnation. Thus, the soul is eternal, while the physical body is considered as a mere husk or a shell that carries the true life, or jiva. This cycle of birth, death, and rebirth repeats again and again until the Atman becomes self-aware of its own divine perfection, that it achieves liberation, also known as moksha. The soul achieves moksha when it becomes one with the supreme reality, or paratman, experiencing a cessation of passions, or nirvana, and release from suffering, which is dahuka. And this union with the divine results in ultimate bliss, or anando. This is the ultimate goal which the Hindu yearns to attain. And so, of course, everybody sort of knows some of this, but the role of karma in that. Hinduism stresses that a person's actions or deeds, or karma, have a causative effect. And that's something that we still even use in Western vernacular, as we say, like, oh, karma is going to get you when you do something bad. But thus, good intentions and actions are rewarded, while bad intentions and actions are punished. A person who performs dharma, or righteous way of action or duty, by renouncing evil deeds, worshiping the gods, and fulfilling one's duty to family, is merited with good karma. On the other hand, a person who performs adharma, or unrighteous way of action or neglecting duty, by pursuing wicked deeds, failing to worship the gods, and ignoring one's duties to family, is demerited with bad karma. And so over a lifetime, a person accumulates good or bad karma, determining his or her reincarnation. A person who has lived a good karmic life is reborn in a higher state of being, with their soul transmigrating to a human body. And so they kind of see, like, if you were reincarnated as a human, you obviously sort of did something good. Whereas the greater the merit of one's karma, the greater is one's condition in life, such as being born in a higher caste. And so and that's, we'll say, it's sort of a problematic aspect too, is that a lot of Hindu belief system depends on, if you were born into a rich family, that was because of your deeds in past life that were rewarding you. Meanwhile, a person who has lived a bad karmic life is reborn in a lower state, with his soul occupying an animal's body. And so samsara, meaning wandering, is not eternal. This cyclic existence continues until a person has achieved enough karma leading to virtue or purity, or punya, that they come to self-actualize their true divine identity and break free of the cycle. And Hinduism believes that eventually everyone achieves moksha. And that's sort of a problem. And I don't mean to say this to denigrate Hinduism, but I have read in some places that it's a very problematic issue, because in Hinduism, now I think this is sort of human nature too, that I wouldn't put this on Hinduism because it probably doesn't teach this, but it's sort of implied, and then people run with it. But is this a fault of Hinduism, or is this a fault because people take every belief system and turn it bad somehow? But Hinduism, with the belief that basically rich people, they had a wealthy people had a good karmic life in the past, and that poor people had a bad karmic life in the past. There's this tendency to and the caste system is, to my knowledge, has been abolished or done away with legally, but it still exists, sort of colloquially or in people's minds. But there's this persistent belief in Hinduism that if you are born wealthy, you deserve praise, and if you're because of your past life. Whereas if you're poor, you did something wrong in the past life, and so you deserve to be punished. And so there's sort of not this aspect of like mercy or like, okay, you can improve your situation. It holds people accountable for lives that they may or probably did not live. And then it basically says that they deserve to be poor or that they deserve to be wealthy. And so it assigns sort of a value to it. And then people get treated worse because of it. Now, I don't know if that's sort of a persistent thing or if that was just in the article that I read, but Christianity has its own problems as well. I don't mean to denigrate Hinduism with that. But the importance of funeral rites, Hinduism places tremendous importance on funeral rites or antiesti. These extensive final rites are performed meticulously and with great reverence. Without it, Hindus believe that the spirit cannot transmigrate and is left to wander this realm aimlessly. Thus, the funeral rites are done immediately, seeking to send the departed soul to a favorable life without delay. The rites conclude with the body of the departed being cremated on a funeral pyre, being lit by the eldest son. The body is destroyed so that the spirit is freed to travel to its next stage. Death is often described as sleeping and awakening to a new life. Samsara is often presented in a positive light as a process of learning, whereby the soul becomes self-aware of its divine reality and is purged of its earthly passions through numerous cycles of spiritual evolution. And so that's sort of an interesting look at Hindu burial rites. But I wanted to look up too, like I couldn't really find anything specifically about what Hinduism said about death itself. And so I just typed it into AI, and Google AI said Hindus generally do not interpret death as bad or as a final end, but rather as a natural temporary transition, a transition of the soul from one physical body to the next. Death is viewed as a spiritual journey or a reincarnation or a necessary step toward liberation or moksha from the cycle of birth and rebirth. And so Google AI had to say that Hindus don't necessarily consider death to be bad. They just consider it sort of like a transition, sort of like a way to get to a destination. They kind of look at it as like a car ride, where it's like you're going from one destination to the next, and that just happens to be the vehicle through which you pass. And then also, I wanted to look up the other major world religion is Buddhism, and as I said too, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism are all sort of related. So I didn't want to repeat the whole big thing with what Buddhism has to say about death. So again, Google AI says that Buddhists generally do not interpret death as inherently bad or a final ending, but rather as a natural, inevitable, and neutral transition, a passage from one life to the next within the cycle of samsara. Instead of fear, Buddhism emphasizes understanding death as a reminder of impermanence to inspire ethical living and detachment. Death is viewed as a necessary, unavoidable part of life, and it is a transition to another form of existence dictated by karma. And then Jainism also, Google AI said Jains generally do not interpret death as inherently bad, but rather as a neutral transition of the soul or jiva to a new body. Instead of fearing it, Jainism encourages facing death with equanimity, detached awareness, and spiritual readiness. A calm, conscious death is seen as a culmination of spiritual practice. Death is considered a natural process where the soul leaves one body to immediately take another. And then Google AI, it says Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism are deeply related to dharmic religions originating in ancient India. They share foundational concepts like karma, samsara, and moksha. All emphasize ahimsa, and ahimsa is the principle of nonviolence. That's something that all three, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, all the dharmic religions, all share an idea of ahimsa, which is that we should be nonviolent. But another thing I want to say too, a positive aspect of Hinduism, which was really cool, and something that my wife and I walked into. We went to over in oh, I'm trying to think of the name. It's Dr. Sastry runs it. It's a sanctuary in eastern Pennsylvania. It's a cow sanctuary, Lakshmi Cow Sanctuary. That's the name, and it's over by Indraloka Cow Sanctuary. And we went and visited him the one day, and we walked into this really interesting culture, which we had no idea we were walking into. But we, Dr. Sastry's family was all there, and they were celebrating a Hindu holiday where they feed the cows because they believe that the cows are their reincarnated ancestors. And so they were feeding the cows and basically retelling these stories of their past and reminding their family members about these past events. And they're talking to the cows, and they believe that their ancestors are these cows. And I thought that that was just really interesting and really fascinating. And that was sort of their motivation to being kind to animals, was that now this is sort of a more positive interpretation of Hinduism, is that um, you want to be kind to animals because those could be people that you knew that died. And so that's another aspect of it that's really important too, is like being kind to all life because, they're not strangers. They could be people that you knew, it could be your grandmother for all you know. And so that was sort of a really interesting view of life from that Hindu perspective. And I was really grateful to Dr. Shastri that we visited that day, but both really fascinated by it. Um, but now I'll focus on the Abrahamic religions and what they teach about death. And so Google AI, now it's interesting because Islam and Judaism and Christianity, as much as they're the same, they're also very different. But Islam does not generally consider death to be bad, but rather views it as a natural, inevitable, and essential transition from the temporary life of this world, which is dunya, to the eternal life of the hereafter, or akhirah. Death is seen as a doorway to meeting God, and for believers, a gateway to paradise. And so death is not viewed as annihilation or a negative event, but as a change of state where the soul leaves the body to move from the material world to the unseen realm. Death is considered a return to the Creator, which for a righteous person is a moment of peace. It is often described as a release from the hardships, struggles, and sins of worldly life. Muslims are encouraged to remember death frequently to maintain perspective on life, encourage repentance, and avoid becoming too attached to worldly pleasures. Life is seen as a test, and death marks the end of that testing period before the day of judgment. And so, while the process of dying might involve death, the state of death itself is not seen as evil or inherently negative in Islamic theology. It is viewed as a decreed natural process ordained by God. So, I thought that was really interesting because that, as you'll see, that becomes very different. Um, but I wanted to see too, and Muslims actually, they do believe in Judgment Day, which is very similar to Christianity and Judaism. And they also believe in the second coming, which is the same as Christianity, but not Judaism doesn't believe that. And then Islam also believes in the resurrection of the dead and the world to come. And so they do view Jesus as that individual that will have a second coming, and one who will bring in or usher in the new earth and eliminate the curse. So very similar to Christianity in that aspect, even though the ideas of what Jesus did and they don't have quite as high a view of Jesus as Christians do. But beyond that, Google AI Judaism primarily views death not as bad in a punitive sense, but as a natural, albeit ritually impure transition and a separation of body and soul. It is a life affirming faith that focuses on the here and now, regarding life as a divine blessing. While death is not feared, it is treated with gravity. The Torah focuses on living a righteous life in this world rather than fixating on the afterlife. And the Torah, by the way, is the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then also, it's interesting, it said that it focuses on this world rather than fixating on the afterlife. And I read this one article that talked about why is the Torah so present focused, and a big theory, and this is, historically uh, um, contestable, but because of the Israelites originating in Egypt and then coming back to the Promised Land, they had a big association with the practices of Egypt. And so Egyptians' culture was very much obsessed with the afterlife. Whereas the Israelites then, as a reaction to that, made it so that their religion was very much focused on the here and now. And so that was sort of an interesting thing that reminded me of that. But death is understood as the body returning to the earth and the soul returning to God. That's, I think, directly ripped from Ecclesiastes 3. Dead bodies are considered the ultimate source of ritual impurity, or tamai. reflecting on aberrance of death's disruption of life. And so, Judaic understanding, it's very similar to Christianity, is that dead bodies are considered the ultimate source of ritual impurity, or tamai, which is also the word used to describe unclean animals. And it reflects an aberrance of death's disruption of life. And so Judaism gets very close to saying the same thing Christianity says, is that it abhors death, or it hates death. While not defined by a rigid universal dogma, there is a belief in the immortality of the soul and the world to come, which is known as the Olam Haba. Ultimately, Judaism emphasizes maximizing the sanctity of life, and Judaism teaches that there will be an initial. Something I thought was important was Judaism emphasizes the sanctity of life, and that's something that definitely influenced Christianity. But Judaism obviously teaches that there will be an initial coming, not a second coming, and that Judaism teaches that there will be a new earth or a world to come. However, they don't believe that Jesus is that. There won't be a second coming. There will just be an initial coming. It won't be Jesus. It will be a different Messiah that comes down and saves the world, rather than a second coming or someone that we're familiar with already. And then a big focus of what I want to talk about in this teaching was, like my friend Jared and his wife, more influenced by secular humanism. And that's something that I wanted to focus on, because secular humanism is probably the biggest influence in our world, as far as how it thinks. But like Google AI says, secular humanism is considered a major, influential, non-religious worldview or life stance in modern Western culture, rather than a traditional religion. It emphasizes reason, scientific inquiry, and human ethics, while specifically rejecting supernaturalism and religious dogma. It posits that humanity can be moral and find purpose without belief in deity. It is based on the belief that human beings are capable of becoming ethical and moral without religion or a god, relying on compassion, critical thinking, and experience. It advocates for using science and rational thought rather than faith or superstition to guide life and solve problems. It lacks holy books, dogma, and hierarchical structure. It is considered a major worldview influencing secular ethics and promoting values like human rights, democracy, and social responsibility. Secular humanism is frequently seen as a life stance that guides many people, including atheists, agnostics, and others who do not identify with organized religion. And so what is secular humanism? And probably most people are secular humanists, especially people that are sort of religious nuns, NONES. They're probably more secular humanist. But Google AI says secular humanism generally views death not as an inherently bad evil to be feared, but as a natural, inevitable end to life. While it is seen as a negative event because it stops personal experience and goal achievement, it is also accepted as the very fact that gives the present life its urgency, meaning, and value. Death is considered a normal part of life cycle, often compared to the state before birth. And so many humanists adopt the Epicurean view that because death is the cessation of consciousness, there is no one left to experience pain or misery, meaning it is not to be feared. The focus is on making the most of the present rather than preparing for an afterlife. Humanists often find comfort in the lasting impact one leaves behind through memories, work, and the natural recycling of atoms. And so while some might see it as a loss, the emphasis on it is on acceptance and living full in the here and now. And one thing I want to talk about is how evolution and secular humanism are closely linked in modern thought. With secular humanists view evolution as the essential, naturalistic framework for understanding the origin and development of life. While evolution is a scientific theory, secular humanists adopt it to support a non-theistic worldview, rejecting supernatural explanations for human origins. Secular humanism relies on naturalism, which posits that the physical universe is all that exists. Biological evolution, specifically the neo-Darwinian synthesis, fits this as it explains life's development without requiring divine intervention. And so secular humanists generally see Darwinian evolution as confirmation that humanity is not the result of a special creation, but rather a happenstance in a history that might just as well have left us out. Charles Darwin's work is considered central to the development of humanist thought because it provided a scientific account of human origins, enabling a move away from religious explanations. While they are linked, it is important to distinguish that evolution is a scientific theory, whereas secular humanism is a philosophy. In summary, secular humanism utilizes the scientific theory of evolution to support a naturalistic, anti-supernatural, and human-centered worldview. And so secular humanism, that is the main philosophy that you'll see in our present time. And it's sort of a culture war too, because a lot of times, especially issues when they come into politics, it's really Christianity versus secular humanism. Those are the two main worldviews, and evolution is sort of the secular humanist origin story. That's the story that they use, whereas Christianity and Christians use the Garden of Eden as their origin story. And how we interpret those origin stories depends on a lot about how we think, and a lot of times that's inconsistent, and that's something that I'm highlighting. But the crux of this teaching too is something that I found is that Christianity is alone in teaching that death is bad. And when I say that, it's explicitly says that in the Bible. Like for 1 Corinthians 15:26, it says the last enemy to be destroyed is death. And so like Google AI says, Christianity generally teaches that death is a bad thing, and that it is an unnatural enemy, a consequence of sin, and causes painful separation. And so it's a last enemy. Death is considered a result of the fall. Sin entered the world, and it's described as the last enemy to be destroyed. And so it's not natural. It is not viewed as a natural part of life, but a disruption of God's original creation. And so grief and hope, while death is mourned, Christians are encouraged not to grieve without hope, as death is defeated by Jesus' resurrection. Despite it being a bad consequence, Christian theology emphasizes that for the believer, death has lost its sting. And so that's something that is really important too, is like when my friend said that, the dogs are getting old and they're dying and it's sad. She actually was expressing Christian views. That's very much a Christian belief. Whereas if you're a secular humanist, you don't really have any foundation to really say that. And the reason is too, it says evolution requires death, the origin of death by Dr. Werner Gitt on July 5th, 2012. And I wanted to point this out because a lot of secular humanists, they have this view that death is bad, but they don't really, what they're actually doing is expressing Christian principles, not secular humanist principles. But it says the tragic effect that evolution and its view of death has on evolutionists becomes quite clear. The evolutionary view of death underscores and reveals the impossibility of reconciling evolution with biblical doctrine. And so with evolution, the following four basic tenets substantiated by many references can be deduced. And this is ultimately what secular humanists should believe based on their own tenets. But one, death is an essential prerequisite for evolution. In evolutionary thought, death plays a fundamental role. It is a necessary precondition for the succession of postulated events. C.F. von Weizsäcker states, if individuals did not die, evolution would not have been possible, and no new organisms with new characteristics could have originated. Evolution requires the death of individuals. Hans Mohr, a biologist from Freiburg, made a similar statement saying, no life could have existed if there was no death. Death as such was not caused by evolution. Rather, the death of individuals is required to ensure the development of the tribe. There is no way past this precept, this axiom of the doctrine of evolution. Without the death of individuals, there could have been no evolution of life on this earth. If we regard the evolution of life as a positive result, as the real creation, then we accept our own death as a positive creative factor. And the strong contrast with the Bible, which explicitly characterizes death as a hostile power, now becomes clear, and that's in 1 Corinthians 15:26 as well as Revelation 6:8. Death is an invention of evolution. Death is an invention of evolution. Professor Widmar Tanner of Regensburg, Germany, who as a biologist concerned himself with the question of death, concluded that the known laws of physics and chemistry, which also hold for biology, at no point force us to assume that a biological system must grow old and die. From this viewpoint, he asks, how and why did death enter our world when it should not properly be here? He assumes that evolution itself invented death as a significant factor. Aging and length of life are adaptive phenomena which developed in certain specific ways for each kind during the course of evolution. And what he means to say too is that, certain species are basically biologically immortal. Like I think like jellyfish, and I think turtles are pretty close to that too. Like they live for hundreds of years, or they're biologically immortal. And so how exactly did death become something that is different within species? But the process of evolution was speeded up substantially by the invention of death. He regards the introduction of death as an opportunity for chance to try out new developments. The anti-biblical character of evolution becomes quite clear when its advocates elevate death to be the creator of life. For Ludwig von Bertalanffy, death is the calculated price that had to be paid for upward development. That dynamic drama full of tension and tragic complications, with great effort, life rose up to increasingly sophisticated levels, paying for each advance. Unicellular organisms developed into multicellular beings, thereby introducing death. And he contrasts this again with the Bible. He says that with which the Bible describes as a judgment on sin is heralded by evolutionists as a necessary product of evolution. Death entered this world when multicellular organisms developed. Pain was introduced when the nervous system originated, and fear was the result of consciousness. Possessions resulted in worry, and the development of morality caused doubts and uncertainty. And so, three, death is the creator of life. The anti-biblical character of evolution becomes quite clear when its advocates elevate death to be the creator of life. Microbiologist R.W. Kaplan explains this as follows. For bisexual organisms, this pre-programmed death has an additional function. The limited life expectancy and the limitations of sexuality prevent the interchange of genes between successive generations. That is, between obsolete predecessors and progressive descendants. Aging and death prevent backward fertilization and thus promote evolution. For the individual, aging and death is unavoidable and distressing, especially in the case of human beings, but it is the price that had to be paid for our existence through evolution. Tanner also emphasizes the creative role of death. It is not a very comforting thought that man would probably not have developed if there were no death, but when it comes to aging and death, one should not expect any consolation from a biologist. And so Hans Mohr answers his own question about the developmental program that invariably leads to death as follows. Because Homo sapiens came into being as a result of evolution, the temporal limits of individual life is the unavoidable prerequisite for the emergence of man. And so they very much see death is very much an aspect of evolution that is why it functions. And then also for death, the final and absolute termination of life. According to evolutionary doctrines, life is a condition of matter based solely on physical and chemical laws. This reduction of reality to exclusively material phenomena leaves no room for life after death. Man is reduced to a biological machine, and his death is on level with that of any organism. In the cogs and mechanisms of evolution, the purpose of death is to give rise to new life. A person's life is regarded as a mere contribution to the progress of evolution. Even when death researcher Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who I studied her a lot actually when I was in nursing school, refers to life after death, she only considers its contribution to evolution. The obligation of personal maturity requires that every single person contributes to the maturity and evolutionary development of the entire species. In this way, everyone fulfills his or her destiny. Death is the key to evolution. In contrast, Christianity alone confronts the problem of death, declaring that it is an enemy. 1 Corinthians 15:26. And so the Bible explicitly states that earth and all of its life came into being by direct creative acts of God. When creation was finished, God pronounced it completed and described it as very good. God is love. He is full of mercy, and he created everything through Jesus, which they cite John 1:10 and Colossians 1:16, and through his wisdom, Colossians 2:3. That is completely different from the evolutionary strategy of pain and tears, gruesomeness and death. Anybody who regards God as the cause of evolution by assuming such a method of creation distorts God's nature into something contrary to itself. We know that death is everywhere. All people die, including recently born babies as well as the aged. People with high moral standards and also thieves and robbers, believers and unbelievers, all are subject to death. Such a universal and radical effect must have a universal cause. The Bible states that death is the result of human sin. And although God had warned the man and woman in Genesis 2:17, they misused the freedom given them and thus fell into sin. From that moment, the law of sin came into effect. The wages of sin is death in Romans 6:23. Since the time of Adam, who was responsible for the introduction of death in 1 Timothy 2:14, all of mankind is bound by this chain of death. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men because all sinned in Romans 5:12. Before the fall into sin, death was unknown throughout creation. And according to the Bible, man was originally good with no pain, sickness, or death. And even in the apocryphal book, The Wisdom of Solomon, 1:13, it is explicitly stated that death was not a component of the original creation. It says, but God did not make death, nor is he pleased with the destruction of the living. And that was an answer to Genesis. And that's actually really interesting too, because there's this, I was reading this one article about how Paul was influenced by Christianity, and that probably is what influenced a lot of his theology, was that Wisdom of Solomon, the belief that Eden was originally death-free. And that's definitely what Paul hints at in Romans 8. But Christianity alone helps us explain why death is so heartbreaking and difficult to cope with. It's an intrusion into our world that does not belong and never belonged. It's why we avoid and fight death through healthcare and safety protocols. And most importantly, for our purposes, it's why Christians should abhor slaughterhouses and animal experimentation labs and find them to be immoral and disgusting. Because based on Christian principles, death is a bad thing. And so Christianity is the only worldview that explicitly states that death is bad. And so, with animal rights activists, we can use this to our advantage because basically anything that's causing death to humans or animals should be condemned because it doesn't align with what God wants for the world. But I found this one other interesting article, Two Histories of Death by Ken Ham on December 1st, 2001. Said when Charles Darwin wrote his famous book On the Origin of Species, he was in essence writing a history concerning death. God's word presents a different view. Annie's cruel death destroyed Charles' tatters of belief in a moral, just universe. Later, he would say that this period chimed the final death knell for his Christianity. Charles Darwin now took his stand as an unbeliever. From his evolutionary perspective on the origin of life, Darwin recognized that death had to be a permanent part of the world. When Charles Darwin wrote his famous book On the Origin of Species, he was in essence writing a history concerning death. From his evolutionary perspective on the origin of life, Darwin recognized that death had to be a permanent part of the world. Undoubtedly, he struggled with this issue as he sought to reconcile some sort of belief in God with the death and suffering he observed all around him, and which he believed had gone on for millions of years. This struggle came to a climax with the death of his daughter Annie, said to be the final death knell for his Christianity. Belief in evolution and or millions of years necessitates that death has been a part of history since life first appeared on this planet. The fossil layers contain billions of dead things supposedly represent the history of life over millions of years. As Carl Sagan is reported to have said, the secrets of evolution are time and death. And so time and death, this phrase sums up the history of death according to those who believe in evolution and or millions of years. In this system of belief, 1, death, suffering, and disease over millions of years led up to man's emergence. 2, death, suffering, and disease exist in the present world. And 3, death, suffering, and disease will continue on into the unknown future. Death is a permanent part of history. And so from the opposite perspective, sin and death, the phrase sums up the history of death according to the Bible. From a perspective of the literal history of the book of Genesis, there was a perfect world to start with, described by God as very good in Genesis 1:31, but it was marred because of Adam's rebellion. And so sin and its consequences of death entered the world that was once a paradise. And that's seen in Romans 5:12, 8:20-21, 1 Corinthians 15:21-22. In 1 Corinthians 15:26, Paul describes death as the last enemy. And that's the point. Death is an enemy. It's an intrusion. The death of man and the animals was not part of the original creation. And even though death reigns in this present world, one day in the future, there will be no more death. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. In Revelation 21:4. And so the implications for the Christian, which history of death you accept, has major theological implications. The perfect creation with no death, disease, or suffering is described as very good. The Bible makes it clear that God does not delight in death. We read in Ezekiel 33:11, say unto them, as I live, said the Lord God, I have no pleasure in the death of the wicked, but that the wicked turn from his way and live. Turn you from your evil ways, for why will you die, O house of Israel? God takes no pleasure in the afflictions and calamities of people, like death. The Bible makes it obvious that death is the penalty for our sin. And so, in other words, it is really our fault that the world is the way it is. God is a loving, merciful God. And when we sinned in Adam, we effectively said that we wanted life without God. All of us also sin individually. Romans 3:23. God had to judge sin as he warned Adam he would in Genesis 2:17 and 3:19. So in doing so, in essence, man forfeited his right to live. However, even though we are sinners, those who have turned from their sin and trusted Christ for forgiveness will spend eternity with their Creator in a place where righteousness dwells, and there will be no more crying, suffering, or death. The true history of death, as understood from a literal Genesis, enables us to recognize a loving Creator who hates death, the enemy that will one day be thrown into the lake of fire. Revelation 20:14. And that's the source on that. But that's really important to recognize too, because you'll hear a lot of secular humanists or non-religious people, that you'll see them crying at funerals, or you'll see them, saying that, oh, it's so sad that my dog died. But on what foundation do they have to stand and say that that is what they truly believe? It's just a feeling, and not that that makes it wrong, but they haven't really investigated it to make a coherent worldview. Whereas Christianity provides that coherent worldview. It says, well, you know what? I find that my dog dying is very sad. Why do I think that? Well, the Christian perspective says that death is an enemy, and it's not. It was never meant to be something that God wanted for the world. That makes sense why I'm so upset about it. So you see, it establishes a coherence, and that's really like the biggest part of philosophy. It's what everybody's looking for philosophy. And then this final article, it says The Problem of Death by Dr. Terry Mortensen on September 1st, 2017. But it was last featured June 30th, 2023, featured in Answers magazine. At some point, everyone struggles with tragedy. Without the Bible's account of creation, there are no good answers. Why is the world filled with death? Why did my friend's 3-month-old son recently die in the ambulance on the way to the hospital? What kind of God would make a world where 3-month-old babies die? And what about natural disasters like the earthquake that killed hundreds of thousands in Haiti in 2010? Or the tsunami the next year that killed thousands in Japan, or the hurricanes and tornadoes that kill hundreds every year? Did God make a world with earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, and tornadoes? Indeed, we struggle with the problem of death, but we don't just struggle to explain human death. What about the death of so many animals that we find buried in the Earth's fossil-filled rocks? On every continent, thousands of feet of sedimentary rock layers are filled with billions of dead plants and animals. Why are they there? Did God make the world that way? And it's not just the death seen in the fossil record. We also see evidence of pain. Some creatures were buried alive, killing. Some creatures were in the stomachs of other creatures, disease, thorns, and extinction. Mass graveyards are full of bones from thousands of animals jumbled together. Would a truly good God create such a world? A good God and a problem of death. And so God is good. He didn't create a world riddled with death, disease, and natural disasters. You see, Genesis 1:29-30 tells us that humans and animals, every beast, every bird, everything that creeps on the earth, were all originally vegan, actually, Genesis 1:29-30. They didn't eat each other. They ate the plants and the fruit of the plants. And God called the creation very good. But it didn't stay very good for very long, because Adam and Eve rebelled against God, and their rebellion resulted in God's judgment, not only on mankind, but also on the whole creation. And so Genesis 3:14-21 tells us that God cursed the animals. He cursed the ground so that thorns and thistles would grow. He caused increased pain in childbirth, and the physical death process began in Adam and Eve. Furthermore, the passage implies that God killed the first animals to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness. But God did not leave mankind without hope. He created us to know him and enjoy him forever, and he cursed the creation to turn our eyes back to him. Romans 8:18-23 says that the whole non-human creation was subjected to futility and now groans in bondage to corruption, waiting to be set free at the return of Christ. And so the vast majority of Bible teachers throughout church history have taught that this futility and bondage resulted from the fall and were not part of the original very good pre-fall creation. And because of Adam's sin, even 3-month-old babies die. But our suffering is only temporary. The gospel assures us of a future without death when Jesus comes again and removes the curse of Genesis 3. And that's the source there. And then I thought this article was really interesting too, just to close it out. But he says, I undertook a course on dealing with grief following trauma, which considered how best to speak with someone following the death of a loved one. I got the opportunity to put a question to the trainer who had covered this topic for more than 20 years. And I inquired if anyone had ever asked, when did death start? He thought for a moment before replying, until now, no. Yet this is a fairly basic and fundamental question. This is, of course, because death is the presumed natural state of affairs for many, perhaps most people. It is humanity's current experience of the order of life. We live, then we die. The majority of people do not think that death had an origin, but rather that it has always been present, and they're also used to seeing nature as red in tooth and claw. But this is not the case. Instead, present-day death has a context. And so no death. Creation, the true history of the origin of humanity can be found in the opening chapters of Genesis. Only Genesis adequately describes the origin of death. At the end of day 6, God looked at his creation, everything he had made, and declared that it was very good. Genesis 1:31. At this time, there was no death for any human or animal, nor carnivory. in Genesis 1:29 to 30. Death was not part of the order of life for animals and humans whom God had imbued with the biblical life principle of Nefesh Haya. And I talk extensively about Nefesh Haya in I Will Abolish the Bow, the book I wrote, as opposed to plant life, which God had not. And so death, the fall, Adam rebelled against the holy God who cannot tolerate sin. As the federal head of humanity, both Adam's sin nature and its consequences, death, have passed on to all of his descendants in Romans 5:12. So we see that the death of human beings was never intended to be the natural state of affairs at all. And the same was true for other Nefesh life too, or animals. Death had a specific entrance and a starting point. The whole of creation was cursed by God in Genesis 3, and every person and animal over the succeeding 6,000 years has experienced or will experience death. And so no death, redemption. Just as there was a start to death, there is also an end to death. The Bible is clear that sin and death have a time limit, and there is a future state to come in which neither will be present. God has decreed that in the future, on the day of judgment, death itself will be thrown into the lake of fire in Revelation 20:14 and Revelation 24. Hallelujah, death will be no more. Death conquered. The Bible is clear that death is an intruder, an enemy, and was not part of God's original creation. Death's finality, just as death's origin is a historical reality, so too is its finality for every human being is very real. But just as there is finality in death for us all, so too death's reign over humanity itself has a finality. Death is currently framed in the context of our present day infirmities, but the Christian's hope and confidence is that in the future it will be no more. And so that's the source on that. And so that article the author very much puts it in a way that says that death is very much a bad thing from a Christian perspective, but it's not the end of the story. Even though it was introduced, it's something that we should oppose, and it's also something that will not exist when Jesus returns. And so the conclusion, Christianity is anti-death, and to be opposed to death is a deeply Christian value that most people are not aware of. It's very much assumed, we walk through life and people say, oh, death is sad. And it's so universal that we don't even think about why it's sad or why it's bad. And Christianity very much has an answer to that. To express sadness or opposition to death is deeply Christian behavior. And so that's something that I like to point out to a lot of people, that in this very deeply secular age we live in, a lot of people have this idea that, oh, death is bad. And it's just so commonplace and such a human experience that they're justified just because of the commonality of the argument. But they don't realize that Christianity is basically the belief system that they're expressing when they say that death is bad. Whereas all other major world religions, they might comment here and there on death, but they don't explicitly say that it's a bad thing. And that's something that I think is very unique in Christianity. And when we express that with animal rights, when we say that, one of the things that our ministry works on is that animals should not be killed for entertainment, food, fashion, or experimentation. And so on what basis can we make that claim? Well, it's because the Bible says that death is bad. And so we should not be killing animals in any form, really, based on that principle. And so my friend, like I answered at the beginning, she was upset because her dogs are dying. And it is deeply sad, but that's not because of the worldview that she aligns with. It's because of the Christian worldview that she expresses that. Now, it might be, it's probably based on personal feelings, but how is that based on anything beyond your own personal opinion? And so what foundation do you have to declare that death is bad? And Christianity offers that. And so that's the conclusion. I want to say too that this is teaching 57. I'm stopping at teaching 60. And so, and then I'm going to move on to some other things. But next 2 weeks is Desmond Doss. It's a teaching on Desmond Doss. So I'm excited for that. He was the subject of the movie Hacksaw Ridge. So I'm going to talk about that. That's going to be a really great one. He's probably the person I admire the most in the world. Someone I really look up to. But I'm going to close out in prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for allowing me to teach your word and to teach your principle that death is an enemy and something that Christians should abhor in this context, especially in regards to animals. And when we see slaughterhouses and experimentation, that's something that Christians should very much oppose based on Christian principles, because death is a bad thing. Help us to bring in a world that you call in Isaiah 11:6-9, a place where righteousness dwells. And that concludes the teaching, but I'll see you guys in 2 weeks. But have a good Sunday, and I'll see you in 2 weeks. And have a great rest of your day and week. Thanks.